mann som vecklar bröd och snusbullar.
Hello everyone, it's Shawna once again, moving on with the how to build a random content generator website. And we're in the beginning phases of this, really beginning laying the foundations of HTML and CSS and JavaScript. In the last tutorial, we left off with doing block and inline elements. And now in this tutorial, I want to talk about a thing called inline block elements and maybe get into floats. And I'll be referencing the W3 schools, and I'll put the link in the description below to help you along. And before we learned about how the block elements take up 100% of the screen, and those are in purple, right? As we made a class for them to be a background of purple. And then with the inline elements, we made that matrix green color, and you can see that they only take up, as much space as the characters need to. Now let's go ahead and start with the code, and let's kind of clean things up, and you can follow along and delete all these things and get it to just two, or let's get it down to these couple of elements. Let's do one, we'll have one div and then one span to work with. And I want to go ahead and Control X to move that up here, and we're going to work with elements at a time to see what happens when we make them an inline element or inline block element. So go ahead and save that, and let's keep these the way they are for now, and we'll hit Control S to save, come to here, HTML, Control S to save, and come to our page and refresh. So we're back here to just one inline element and one block element. The way you can think of what an inline block element does is it's like a hybrid, and it kind of gives you like the flexibility of both the inline and the block elements. And W3 Schools does a pretty good job here of saying, compared to inline, the major difference is that display inline, which is what you use to make an inline block, allows to set a width and height on the element. And then compared to display block, the major difference is that inline block does not add a line break after the element, so the element can sit next to each other. So we'll go over these one by one so we'll get a really good understanding of what this is saying. So first, let's start with the inline type of element, which is the span text here. And let me go ahead and to make this easier, we'll call this the inline element, which is a span. Okay, and then I'm actually going to change it a little bit here. I'm going to delete the div, and what I'll do is I'll use a p tag, because a p tag by default is a block element. So we'll put block element, and then we'll say p, paragraph. All right, and we want to give this, we'll go ahead and change this to we'll go ahead and rename this to a block class, because that's what it is. It's a block class. We'll copy that. We'll come to the P. We'll give it a class and set that to block class. Control S to save. Control S to save. And then let's go ahead and revamp the code here. I want to Control X, and I'm going to move it up here. And I'll put it here, and what I want to do is I'll rename this inline class. Inline class. So we'll go ahead and copy that. Control C to copy, and then we'll put the span, which again, the span is an inline type of element. So we'll go ahead and paste that. Control V, Control S to save. So we've renamed these. We've reassigned these classes as an inline class and block class, which correspond to these colors. So let's go ahead and refresh and make sure everything should work. There we go. And that's just to help with the tutorial, since we're not going to be dealing with a div right now. So what happens if we try to change this inline class? So what happens if we want to say width, and we say we want to make it 500 pixels? So what's going to happen? Well, go ahead and make the change. Control S to save and refresh. Well, it didn't move. It didn't work. You know, normally you would think that if you tell it, if you make it say, hey, be 500 pixels, it's going to make it 500 pixels. But the thing is, with the inline elements, they're going to only take up only the width of what is inside of them. So even if you try and say, hey, make it 500 pixels wide, it won't work. So now let's try height. As you can see, I just did an auto type. Let's try to make it 100 pixels, right? Control S to save. We'll come back to the page and refresh, right? Well, nothing's happening. All right. Now really quickly, what if we apply these sizing styles to the block class? Well, let's try it out and let's see what happens. So Control C to copy and Control V to paste. Control S to save. Come here and let's see what happens. Well, hey, it worked on the block element. Well, that's the behavior of a block element, because you can come in here and you can say, hey, block element become 500 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall. And that's just the way that when they developed CSS and HTML tags and things, that's just the way they did it. So what the inline block will do, so what that does is it overrides the natural behavior of an inline class element like a span. And by doing that, it will allow, by doing the inline block, that will allow you to assign a width and a height, right? So let's go ahead and delete that. And come here, hit refresh. Well, how do we go about changing this element into a inline block element? So what we'll do is we'll modify this existing class for the example. So all you have to do to make this an inline block is you use the display. You start with display and you just type, and then what you do is you can see here you've got display block and inline block and all these different things. We want to go ahead and select the inline block. You can go ahead and click that and make sure you put the semicolon and hit Control S to save. And let's come to our web page and refresh. Well, hey, there we go. Now this inline class, now the inline class is actually an inline block, but we're just using this to name it, right? But you can see now that, hey, it's 500 wide and it's 100 pixels tall. And remember, we couldn't do that before. So this inline block allows you to assign widths and heights to the inline class. Now for fun, why not go ahead and comment this out? So highlight it, and you hold down Control and the /. So now that it's commented out, the browser won't read this, and we'll go ahead and hit Control S to save, and we'll come back to our web page, and boom, there we go. We're back to the inline element behavior. All right. So let's go ahead and hit Control Z to make it inline block again, and hit Control S to save. Now for the block class, let's come back here to the W3 schools and said, so compared to display block, the major difference is that display inline block does not add a line break after the element, so elements can sit next to other elements. And so coming back to our web page here, now we're focusing on, coming back to our web page here, now we're going to focus on the block element, which is, in this example, we're going to use a P. And you can see that it takes up the whole entirety of the 100%, right? And let's come in here. We'll come to our HTML page, right? Our HTML document. We'll go ahead and copy this. Control C and Control V to paste. Control S to save. Come here and we'll hit the refresh button. And then, so you'll see that these two block elements, you can see that these block elements are taking up 100% of the width here, and it's going down to the next one is coming down. Okay, so what happens if, and we're just going to stick with the naming convention here for fun, but we can change this later. What happens if we take the display inline block and we apply it to the block class? Well, let's find out. So I went in here and I copied that, and I come down here and hit Control V to paste, Control S to save, and we'll come to our web page and we'll refresh. Well, what happened here? You can see that the block elements shrunk up. The block elements are now behaving kind of like the inline. So now the block elements are side by side. Well, before they were stacking on top of each other, kind of, right? And now, well, these shrunk up next to this inline element. But this thing was an inline element, but the P is supposed to be a block element. Well, when you override it with display inline block, you get rid of that new line. So no longer will you go to a new line, right? And for simplicity's sake, let me go here and let me go ahead and comment out this line so we can just deal with the two P's that are now inline block. So I highlighted it, hold down Control / to comment it out, Control S, come back to our page and refresh, and now we'll just look at the two P tags by themselves. Well, now, you know, we've got the inline block. So what happens if we take the width and the height, we hit copy, we'll come down here and hit paste, boom. Well, let's see what happens. Now they're 500 wide and 100 pixels tall. And now you're wondering, well, why is this thing stacking? It didn't stack before, and that's because of float and wraparound. But check this out. When you zoom out, when you zoom out, they line up. And you'll learn about this kind of thing when you have to deal with responsive web pages. But the page is flowing. Remember, we talked about page flow and float. Well, these elements float kind of naturally to the left, naturally by default. But when you zoom into the page, well, there's not enough room, so these things they're forced to wrap around to the bottom. But again, if you zoom out, well, it stays on one line. So you have to be mindful of sizing and your percentage of whatever screen that you're working with. Coming back to our HTML document, I want to hit Control Z to undo that comment, Control S to save. So now we've got our inline class, which is overridden by an inline block, and we have our block class, which is overridden by the inline block, right? So they're all kind of behaving the same way, right? You know, as I zoom out, they start lining up side by side, and that's because of the zoom. And then when we zoom back into the normal page, you can see that they're flowing. So what happens if we take 2 or 3 of these span classes, and then we have 4 of those? Well, what's going to happen now? Well, it's all kind of the same thing, right? Uh-oh. What happened here? You see a problem? How the inline elements, they're all, what happened to the gap? We put the inline block. The inline elements still have their inherent margin behavior. And this can be frustrating to deal with. And you can see here the P's, they have a gap between them. Even though we used inline-block to make them 500, they still retain their gaps, their margins, after each element. And this is a frustrating thing with with CSS and dealing with block and inline-block, inline stylings. And you'll just have to get used to this and things like that. And coming back to W3 schools, the inline elements, we couldn't set the width and the height, but going inline block allows you to change your width and height. And with the block, it takes away the line break, but it still retains the inherent margins that are with a block. And vice versa, even though you put inline block with an inline element, it still retains the behavior of not having a margin because the margins are collapsed. So what happens if we come to our inline class, right? Our spans are the inline class. So what happens if we come in here and we type in margin bottom? Let's go with 2rem. Okay. Control S to save. We'll come back here and I'll hit refresh. So now our inline elements, now we have a margin on the bottom. The inline elements still retain not having a margin on the bottom unless you come in here and you specifically tell it to have a margin bottom of 2, right? Now, check out the P elements, right? They have an inbuilt margin on the bottom. So what happens if we come in here and we come to margin bottom? We'll copy that. And let's make it obvious. Let's see about margin bottom 4rem. Control S to save. We'll come here and hit the refresh. Well, there you go. You're going to add an additional 4rem to the inherent margin of the P of the block class, even though we've applied the in-block styling to it. So let's go ahead and do something interesting. What happens if we do margin bottom 0? I'm going to hit Control S. We'll hit refresh. Well, now the margins are narrow, right? Let's go ahead and comment this out. Control /, Control S to save. Come back to our page, refresh. Well, now we're back at the default margin. So what's going on? Well, this is something you're going to have to learn. This is something you're going to have to deal with CSS. And so this is something you're going to have to keep in mind when you're styling with display inline block, when you're working with elements that are inherently inline or inherently block elements. So what's happened? Let's see what happens if we do margin bottom none. Control S to save. Come back here, refresh. Nothing changes. Well, for funsies, what happens if we do margin bottom negative 12 pixels? It might be, well, it collapses the border down. But you don't want to get into this. I'm just demonstrating this to show you that what you can do with this is you can eventually learn how to do very granular control of margins. And I'll show you as we go along how we can do this. So let's just go ahead and delete that and get back to what we had before, right? All right, so we've kind of played around with the bottom, and I want to also demonstrate something to you really quick about padding. And we haven't gone over padding yet, and I'll do more details about padding on a simpler example. But for right now, I want to show you that when you're dealing with CSS, you're going to have to learn some of the behaviors of what happens when you add certain styles to elements. So we'll go ahead and add a padding. And what padding does is it adds kind of like a space between the outside of the element edge, if you want to see it that way, and the inner content. But again, not everything is as it seems. So let's go ahead and hit a padding of 1 rem. And in theory, this should keep everything, this should basically make like a padding inside of everything will be 1 rem away from the top, bottom, left and right sides of the edge of the element. But that's not always how it works, and let me show you what happens. So remember that the width and height is 500 and 100 pixels, right? So we've added this padding, which adds 1 rem. Control S to save. We'll come here, and you'll notice how, notice the height and notice the width, and notice how the text is up against, the edges of the element, right? So go ahead and watch carefully, hit refresh. Well, now they're bigger. Now the element is bigger. But hey, we said 500 pixels, but now it's no longer 500 pixels. And when we put the padding of 1 rem down and 1 rem to the left, and it's not showing here, but there's padding all around it on all 4 sides. Well, that's going to expand the element. And again, when they built this system out, they didn't think about this, or maybe they did, but they figured, well, hey, they're just going to have to get used to it. Down here, we didn't change the block class. We didn't add padding to the block class. It's still 500 by 100. So this is something that makes CSS frustrating and tedious. So we come in down here, and what happens if we add padding to the Inline-block class that was inherently a block class? Go ahead and hit Control S, and let's see what happens. Come down here, refresh. Well, it too is now having the same behavior of not being 500 pixels wide anymore, and that's just kind of the nature. And that's what you're going to have to learn about when you start messing around with things like Inline-block. So now playing around, what happens if we go ahead and get rid of the Inline-block and the width and the height? And we'll just go ahead and comment those out. Hit Control S, and we'll come down here to the block class, and we'll go ahead and comment these out, and Control / and now we're kind of back to where we started before. And let me go ahead and get rid of that. So now let's see what happens. Remember, we've gone back to, like we had before in the second video, we're back to the original. This is a inline element class, which is proper here, inline class with the green color. We're just going to add padding to the inline class. And then same thing here with the block element class here. We're just going to add padding 1 rem. Okay, well, let's come back here and refresh. Well, this is interesting. We've added padding. Now you remember that beforehand, without the padding, we'll go ahead and comment these out and hit Control S and come back. So this is with padding applied, right? And then come back in here. Well, now everything's collapsed down. So when you apply padding to, the inherent block and inline elements, you're going to make the element expand. Okay, let me go ahead and hit Control Y, or hit Control Z again, so we can see the effect of padding once again. We'll hit Control S. Remember, this is before padding and after padding. And you can see, before the inline elements took up only the space they need. But when you add padding, well, it pushes out the element to include the padding. And the same thing with the display block, the block level elements, right? It now has padding. And this will be critical to understand when you're developing your layout. Okay, so we've seen that. Now let's go ahead and uncomment these to bring back the inline block styling. Control S to save. Come back to our page, refresh, and we're back here again, right? And what I want to do is I want to introduce something to you called box sizing. And what box sizing do is it'll kind of deal with padding. And let me go ahead and comment on the block class here. Comment that out so we can see the difference between the two. So remember, we're explicitly telling 500 pixels wide by 100 pixels tall, 500 by 100 for both classes, right? And you can see here how we've got the padding, and it pushes out and it makes the elements bigger. Let me go ahead and put margin bottom of 2 rem to make it easier to see for the inline, inherently inline classes. So as you can see here, you know, these are still 500 by 100, right? These are now 500 pixels wide plus 2 rem on each side, plus 1 rem on each side for 2 rem plus 500 pixels. And then the height is 100 plus the 1 rem up here and 1 rem down here for like 500 pixels plus 2 rem. And maybe I should have used pixels but for the padding, but just roll with me on this. So if we use this thing called box sizing, we can prevent the padding from stretching out or making the element bigger. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So just type in box sizing right here. Box sizing shows up. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to say border box. And that's going to say, hey, we want this element, we want these element classes to only be 500 by 100 pixels, right? And border box is going to prevent this padding from stretching out or pushing out the element. And what'll happen is the padding will be kind of like pushed inside the box. It won't push the box out. The padding is going to go inward. So it'll kind of reduce how much text space you have within the element. And I'll go ahead and show you that real quick. So we've made our change. And remember, we've got 500 down here and 500 up here, right? And now we've got the box sizing. Let's go ahead and hit Control S. And remember, this is before we applied box sizing. And keep in mind, we've got our padding, right, of 1 rem. And we'll hit refresh. Well, now the element is now actually 500 pixels by 100 pixels tall. And the padding is now confined or contained within the element itself. And now it's explicitly remaining 500 pixels. And for me, box sizing is something that I wish I had a good fundamental grasp on and someone had explained it to me when I first got it started coding, because it makes layout a lot easier, and especially if you are developing your own lightweight framework. And I have my own lightweight framework that I use for responsive design that is extremely lightweight and performant compared to like Bootstrap CSS and easier to understand. So I wanted to apply that box sizing to the block class. Right now, the inherent block class that we're overriding with the inline block. And we Control S to save and refresh. And as you can see here, now we have the padding all around the element, right? Now we have the padding all around the text on the top and left, and it's also on the bottom and right hand side. Okay, yeah, that's how you can force your elements to be a certain size. Alright, so we've messed around with the inline block. So now I want to talk about float and page flow. And for simplicity's sake, let's go ahead and comment out our block level elements that don't take up 100% of the screen and refresh. So we're just going to deal with our inline elements, right? So float is, well, so float, and as I told you, and as I mentioned in the previous video, we have a thing called page flow. And the page flows from the elements within the page naturally flow top to bottom and left to right. And that's why, you know, these inline elements are one by one. They start at the left. They always try to find the furthest left that they can go. And if they find something in the way, they're just going to bump into it and stack on top of each other. And like we did yesterday, let me go ahead and copy this and put a whole bunch of them here. And go ahead and do that. Hit refresh. So all these elements are floating left to right and then top to bottom. And they're stacking. You know, they're trying to bunch up as much as I can to the top left corner, but the page flow pushes them down and to the right, right? Control Z to get back to 3 of them. Control S. Now you don't have to type in float left inherently because that's what naturally happens, but if you start using floats with your elements and div, you're going to have to use them or else you're going to break the page flow. So we'll add this float left and we'll come here and we'll hit refresh. Uh-oh, what happened? Well, when we added this float, this overrode the default behavior of the inline. So if you remember, the default behavior of an inline by itself on the page will put spacing. And again, this is one of those frustrating things about CSS that you're going to have to get used to and why they have all these frameworks out there. So when you apply the left float, everything's going to bunch to the left and it collapses the margin. All right. So what happens if we once again come in here, copy these, paste, refresh. Sorry I'm going fast, but you'll see everything's collapsed and it's still floating to the left. All right. And let's go ahead and just comment that out. All right. Now one thing I want to show you now, refresh everything, come back to our styles, is I want to show you float right. And this is a way that you can override and say, hey, I want everything to float from the right side of the page. Okay. We'll come here, we'll hit refresh. Well, instead of starting here on the left hand side, all of the elements are now floating on the right hand side. You see? Now, one thing I want to show you really quick, I want to add 01, 02, 03. Control S. I'm adding these to our span tags. And I want to show you what's going on here. 1, 2, 3. But this thing's going 1, 2, 3. You would think this should be 1, this should be 2, and this should be 3. Well, that's not how it works. Because remember, the code is reading top to bottom. And the first one it's going to read is 1. And it's going to say, hey, put 1 here. But since we are floating to the right, float right, it's going to take number 2 and stack it against number 1. And then it's going to take number 3 and stack it against number 3. So what happens when we come here and we change float right back to left, hit Control S, and we'll come in here and save that again for good measure. We'll come to our page and we'll refresh the page. Well, now it's 1, 2, 3. Well, again, not everything is as it seems, and these are things you're going to have to get used to when you work with CSS. What happens if we come down here to our block elements, let's go ahead and name these 01, 02, 03, and 04. So remember, our inline classes have the float left applied, but our block classes do not. Okay. Let me go ahead and make sure I saved. Control S, come back to our page and refresh. Well, what happened? Shouldn't this block element be 100%? Well, yet again, these are one of the things you're going to have to learn about and deal with CSS layout. And for some reason, when they develop float, when you apply a float, it breaks the page. So if you want to make sure that your elements behave like they did before, you're going to have to come in here and explicitly tell all the elements to behave that way, behave float left. And then look what happened here. Well, that's because of the override of the float left. And this is why, again, it's so frustrating with CSS, because you put in float left and you think, well, that's going to fix everything. But no, you have to come in here and explicitly tell the block class to width 100%. Control S to save. Come back to our page, refresh. So now it's behaving like it's supposed to, like it naturally did if you didn't explicitly put float in here. So again, let's go ahead and comment that out to show you that if you float one thing and don't float the other, explicitly float it, and that's frustrating and annoying. And this will be very important when you go to do your own framework, and this is important to understand how box models work and CSS things work. Okay? So what happens if we do something fun? We'll go ahead and get this back to a width of 100%. We'll hit refresh. Well, we got that going again, right? Well, what happens if we float right and then we'll float our inline classes to the right and float our block classes to the left? Well, let's see what happens. Okay, well, that's cool. That's still working. Now, what happens if we do float right for a block class? Everything still works. And you'll notice that the blocks still are 1, 2, 3, 4, or these are now backwards 1, 2, 3, 4, because remember, we're going top to bottom. But since all the inlines are bunching, they want to bunch to the right hand side, they want to float right, it's all reversed like we did before. Okay. So how about this? Let's go ahead and comment out all of our block elements and hit Control / Control save. And then let's come up here and then we'll go ahead and copy these, paste these below, and then we'll do _ right. And what we'll do is we'll make a class, and we'll go ahead and apply that there. And we'll go 1R, 2R, 3R. And what we'll do, we'll copy that class, and we'll make a class up here. And then we'll make a class with a period, Control V to paste. And we're going to make the inline class up here. these will be left. We'll float these left. All right. And then what we'll do is we'll copy this, come down here and paste it, and we'll go ahead and select another color. And with this color picker here, I know we didn't go over it yet, but you can pick this. Sometimes this thing will be glitchy and it won't work, but a lot of times it does work. So let's go ahead and select some other color here, like a light blue, and then we'll float all the ones to the right. We'll make them a blue background color. So we've made the changes here. Control S to save, Control S to save, and let's refresh the page. All right, so we've got our elements, our left elements, float left, 1, 2, 3, and then we have our right elements floating here, 1, 2, 3. But again, look how this thing is working. Look how it's flowing down. The left elements are wanting to do their thing. They want to bunch up and to the left. And the right elements are wanting to bunch up and to the right. And for funsies, scroll out your page. So you can see the behavior of what will happen with float left and float right. Now what happens if we zoom in the page? Oh, well, now it's all shades of fun. So by playing around with floats, you can see how floats affect the behavior of the elements, right? So coming in here and playing around with CSS and, you know, playing around with it, fooling around, see what works, see what doesn't work, seeing how things behave, that's how you really learn how to do layout in CSS. You know, you can go out there and you can copy and paste code and try and figure it out and just go with the flow, but you're going to lose a lot. Only until you get in here and you start playing with these things, you can get a feel of how they behave. And personally, in the frameworks that I've developed and that I use for my web applications, I like to use Inline-block, as you've seen in this video, because it gives you a lot of control and granularity of your elements, of your, and especially when you come in here to start making your own divs. And in my frameworks, I do widths by percentage, and that's a little unique because a lot of frameworks use like columns. You know, it's Bootstrap uses columns, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the method that I use percentages, and I know how to design pages responsive that work well with REM text, font sizes, and percentages, and it works out really, really well. And you don't have this obtuse framework like Bootstrap has when you have all these divs nested within divs with call and spans and all this kind of stuff, and it really simplifies code. And during this tutorial series, I'll show you how I build out my own frameworks. So I think this has been a really good tutorial about an introduction to Inline-block and floats. And this isn't the whole overarching definitive things on Inline-block and floats. This is just to get your feet wet and to know how they work at a basic level and to know what's coming and what you're going to dealing with CSS styles. So with that, I'm going to go get me a cup of coffee and plan out my next lesson, and I look forward to doing another lesson with you all. Bye bye.